Jazz music is an important part of history, and a lot of the people that made it weren't very nice. Today, we're going to tell you about one of the greatest and meanest musicians that ever lived. Sidney Bechet was born in New Orleans on May 14, 1897. His father played the flute, and his brothers also played several instruments. Sidney learned to play all of the instruments in his home, but he decided to focus most of his efforts on the clarinet. Later in life, he would also play the saxophone. Sidney was extremely influential in the early days of jazz. He played with Louis Armstrong and helped develop what would become known as the swing style. In addition to being a great musician, Sidney was also a very difficult person. He wanted to be the center of attention when he performed on stage. Other musicians that wanted to perform solos found it almost impossible to share a stage with Sidney Bechet. He would also play so loud that their instruments couldn't be heard. Sidney eventually left New Orleans and moved to Chicago, but he had a habit of causing trouble everywhere he went. Most of the time, it involved women. One night in 1917, he was flirting with a woman by a lake after playing a show. He said something that made her angry, so she pulled out a knife and stabbed him. Sidney and his fellow musicians were taken to jail. Later that evening, after they posted bail, he returned to flirt with the woman some more. As he traveled the world playing music, Sidney continued creating conflict at every opportunity. In 1922, he was in England and began spending time with a prostitute. The two got into a fight, and Sidney was arrested. He was then deported from England back to the United States. In September 1925, he traveled with several other musicians to Paris, France. In the United States, black jazz musicians experienced a lot of discrimination. In France, they were treated very well. This made Sidney very happy, but it didn't stop him from getting into trouble. One night, while playing at a club in Paris, a fellow musician accused Sidney of playing a wrong chord. He challenged the man to a duel, saying, "Sidney Bechet never plays the wrong chord." Sidney then pulled out his gun and tried to shoot the man. He missed and hit a woman nearby. He spent 11 months in jail for this offense. After being released, he was deported back to the United States. He also played with some of the greatest musicians of the day, including Duke Ellington. Duke Ellington thought Sidney was an incredible musician, but had problems playing with him. The reason why was that he loved dog fighting, and he also had a very large dog. Sidney would bring it on stage with him, which bothered Duke Ellington. Ellington was smart enough not to say anything about it. But that wasn't the case for Gavin Bushnell. Gavin, like Sidney, played woodwind instruments, and he also made a comment that his dog could beat Sidney's dog in a fight. One day at 3 a.m, Gavin awoke to someone pounding on his door. He opened the door and Sidney Bechet was standing there. He told Gavin, "I heard that you had a dog that you said was more dog than my dog." Sidney wanted the two dogs to fight so that he could prove that his dog was superior. Although he was a brilliant musician, after 1932 it was hard to find work, so Sidney opened a tailor shop and worked there for the rest of the decade. He started recording again around 1938, and by the end of the 1940s, Sidney was once again able to earn a living from his musical talents. He moved to Paris in 1951 and got married. A few years later, not long before he died, Sidney wrote his autobiography called Treat It Gentle. He presented himself as a kind soul. But a music producer that worked with Sidney had a different opinion. He said of the book, "The kindly old gentleman in his book was filled with charity and compassion. The one I knew was self-centered, cold, and capable of the most atrocious cruelty, especially toward women." On May 14, 1959, at the age of 62, Sidney Bechet passed away from lung cancer. Despite his poor attitude, Sidney's music lives on. It has been used in the soundtrack for over 60 films.